It's about time I do a commentary on Doodle herself. I was going to cover her video on Umbris, but not only is it disowned now, meaning she won't listen to a word I say, but SketchTB also covered it just fine and I would do it no justice. However, Doodle released a countdown that has its own brand of flaws that I would like to cover. Her top 10 collect-a-thons list is probably the best example of how she's not just bad at commentaries, but bad at countdowns too. This is the first time I have covered an actual countdown, and also the first time since my video on Kong that I am covering a video that's not a commentary, so this will be a bit out of my ballpark. Let's begin.
I sure love me some collectathons. Being probably the most of what I played as a child, the 3D collectathon genre was probably one of the best things to happen to the 64-bit era, and recently in 2017 had a huge resurgence with the likes of the Hat in Time, Yooka-Laylee, and Mario Odyssey.
Huge resurgence means 3. I don't know how you expect me to believe the genre made this massive comeback from its heyday of the late 90s and early 2000s if you only have 3 examples for us to go off of. Like, how dead was the genre? How does Yooka-Laylee, A Hat in Time, and Super Mario Odyssey show that they're coming back? Not being well versed in the genre like you seem to think you are, I'm not caught up with the genre's history. So you, from the gate, leave me lost.
Here's hoping to that sticking. I like collectathons as they tend to allow you to play them in any order with various new things to learn as you do. They really are the speedrunner's best friend.
This is also not explained upon. You explain how the game can be played in any order, but I fail to see how that's more beneficial to speedrunners in comparison to any other genre of game. Also, what does this have to do with your list? You're not a speedrunner, you don't play off of the fact that these games are a speedrunner's best friend, you just drop this onto us and explain nothing.
So because this seems to be common confusion, I'll try to explain what I mean by collectathon, or at least what I mean when I say collectathon.
So is your own personal definition not the correct one? Doodle, if you want to clear up the air to what a collect-a-thon actually is, considering there doesn't seem to be an actual definition for people to look at that would give us a concrete idea, your definition cannot be exclusive to you, otherwise, if we go to someone else who thinks of collect-a-thons differently than you, your definitions may not match up, and it will cause even more confusion. For instance, I found a Reddit post that brings up 2 other ideas of a collect-a-thon that do not at all match with yours. Being a collect-a-thon is either any game that is based on the premise that in order to make progress in the game, you must collect a threshold of items. It is a mechanic of necessity where it would be impossible to complete/beat the game, excluding hacks, if you did not collect one of the possible many different in-game collectibles. Or is more defined by the sheer amount of different things you need to collect, with a high quota of items to collect altogether, which would exclude a couple of entries from your list entirely. But that's the problem, we can't know for certain just what the fuck a collect-a-thon is, because you're specifying that your definition is exclusionary to you, which clears up nothing about the genre.
I'll also try to touch on more important aspects of collectathon 2, being level design, the main character's moveset, difficulty, and how much the player requires to collect.
Of which she barely goes through with at all, as you'll see as we go on.
That said, these aspects won't necessarily sway my opinion on these games, as I just want to look at the games based on how much fun I had playing them.
We'll come back to that. On another note though, why would you mention any of these things if they aren't important to where they're at on the list? The lack of criteria doesn't work in your favor.
On top of that, Rocket controls very nicely, and with the various abilities you get along the way, his movement becomes rather impressive. It's a common practice in collectathons to have to unlock certain power-ups so the player can backtrack to those levels and gather previously unobtainable collectibles, and Rocket is no exception. However, the backtracking with Rocket not only is pretty minimal, but feels less like needless padding for the sake of challenge, and actually feels important to the rest of the game. Looking at you, Donkey Kong, you sadistic monkey. I love you.
Once again, we'll come back to this. But here I'm continued left with more questions. With backtracking in video games, aren't they typically pivotal for them? Like, ignoring the fact that there actually is no backtracking for Rocket Robot on Wheels, what's the actual problem with the backtracking in a game like Donkey Kong? By now, you should be sensing a big problem with this list. Doodle rarely explains anything, she says something is the case, and you have to believe it. In this instance it's totally false though, because you don't have to backtrack. all of the abilities you unlock allow you to move forward into the next level. So here you're lying to your audience about the backtracking in whole.
Unfortunately for our little circus bot though, I can only keep him so high on the list as my experience with him is very limited.
Yes, but I thought your main criteria was regarding how much fun you had in that time frame, so why does the fact you have a limited experience with the game matter when that's not a part of your criteria?
Personally, I feel Yooka-Laylee does a lot of, say, Banjo's problems better, you know? The main one being the wonky controls. Yooka-Laylee doesn't really have those wonky controls. Yeah, it starts incredibly slow, but the more you advance in the game and unlock more and more to traverse the levels, it becomes really easy to do whatever you need for the game. Yes, a lot of the moves are similar to Banjo's, but the difference is I simply find it easier to combo off of Yuka's moves than Banjo's, and the lizard isn't limited to activator pads.
Well, get back to this. But you want to know what could strengthen your point to demonstrate to us that Yoka has smoother controls to Banjo? By showing us a clip of Banjo-Kazooie. Especially one where he's limited to activator pads, otherwise again, we're in the circumstance at taking what you say at face value.
Now that's not to say Yooka-Laylee doesn't have its fair share of flaws, given I could go on tangents about how I get lost while playing it, and how much the minigames can eat the dick I don't want, how much the boss battles spike in difficulty causing the struggle to be real, and the lack of keeping up with your individual progress.
What the hell does view totals mean then, Doodle? You can too track your individual progress per level. This is another instance of you being misinformed about your entries and in turn, misinforming your audience. As far as the level design goes, didn't you just finish complimenting the level design and how big it is?
The level designs are huge to begin with and only get bigger when you expand each world, and throughout that each level gives you a lot to do despite the small number of levels overall.
And now you're complaining about how big the levels are by telling your audience how lost you get in them? How did no one catch the blatant contradiction there? I mean, I know this is Doodle, so contradictory statements is PAR for the course, but that doesn't mean you have to turn a blind eye to it.
Speaking of rare, when people need examples to what the hell a collectathon platformer is, the two prime examples that I tend to give out are the two most famous names in the genre, because that tends to be how examples work, right? We of course have the granddaddy of collectathons himself, Mario, the only guy who's been keeping the collectathon platformer even remotely still alive in the eyes of the public.
Are we just going to ignore Poi? A game that you put in your own intro.
And then we got Rare's Baron Bird mascot duo. I suppose, yeah, their first game is rather low for being one of my prime examples of the genre, but sad to say, I didn't grow up with it like many others did.
But if this is one of your main examples to what a collectathon is, it shouldn't matter if this is one you grew up with. An example to what the genre even is, should be enough to put it higher, as that would show that Banjo is a game you think of as a pinnacle to the genre itself. You're not going to use a game like Rascal to describe this genre, are you? No, because that's not the best examples.
I'm not too familiar with each of the level layouts and goals as everyone else is, and personally I find the controls to be rather wonky in comparison to practically every other collectathon I've played. As with most other collectathons in this caliber, it gets easier to have fluid movements as you're traversing each level. With Banjo-Kazooie, I never got that impression personally.
Then why is this game above both Rocket Robot on Wheels and Yooka-Laylee? Especially since the former you didn't grow up with either, and the latter you straight up describe as does Banjo's problems better, with your main outlook being the controls. This doesn't make any sense being here, especially this high up.
That said, as a collectathon, it's actually really good. The levels are both well designed and laid out in such a way that most of the time you can understand what needs to be done and sit down to actually, you know, do it.
Well then, why did you bring up how you don't know the level design all that well if it doesn't matter and anyone who picks it up can understand it? Doodle, this list is broken. On top of that, why would it matter if it's good for the genre it's in when your only base criteria is how much you enjoyed playing it? Given your intro statements to the entry, we can obtain how you don't much care for it, and how you harp on the game for having bad controls. You obviously don't have that much fun with it, regardless of how good a collectathon it is.
The unlockable movesets are done in a way that, while can be tedious and obnoxious, are rather easy to get out of the way without any repercussions, and becomes fucking vital towards completion to your goal.
Given if you must go through the tedium of unlocking movesets, and it, by your own words, is annoying, wouldn't that make the problem with unlocking moves be more annoying? Like, I don't know about you, but having a requirement to go through something tedious typically is seen as a bad thing. You're not very good at this positivity thing.
I used to have a bad opinion of the movie Toy Story 2. No idea why, because I've never hated its game that basically holds the same plot as said movie, with the prime difference being now I can explore more of the movie's set pieces that at the end of the day would have had no impact on the movie. Perhaps I was just stupid.
Perhaps. Or perhaps you liked it just on the basis of the level design and not the story that the game was telling. You even say that the level design holds no bearing to the movie, which tells us that if you didn't like the movie, it was the story that you disliked, not the setting. If you don't hold that opinion now, that's one thing, but that holds no place in this list as it has nothing to do with your like of the video game.
Rareware and the 64-bit era were really at the top of their game. There's kind of a reason their games get brought up as often as they do in lists like these. While I played a lot of Conker's Bad Fur Day and enjoyed my fair share of Diddy Kong Racing, 1/8 Step into 3 Dimensions will always stick with me as one of their better games overall. And with no pun intended, I rarely hear anyone talking about Donkey Kong 64 outside of the DK rap for the meme. So let me try to do it justice. I like Donkey Kong 64. Scratch that, I like exploring Donkey Kong 64.
That is a really bad start. If the only thing you can say is that you like exploring a game and not actually playing it, then you obviously hold this game in a more negative light to the rest of your list, which begs the question as to why this game is above literally anything before it. This especially gets bad when you hear what she says next.
The minigames are their own classification of gamer hell.
Doodle, you do realize that you get the majority of your collectibles through said minigames, right? You can't avoid these minigames as that's about 80% of the goal. Once again, this shows me that this game is held in a much lower regard to the rest of this list.
Donkey Kong 64 has its own brand of charm that's both a mixture of the already established Donkey Kong Country charm with Rare's own brand of self-aware humor, and a ton of levels that utilize each of the characters that you can control. It's both functional and doesn't look too bad either, which is something not a lot of collectathons know how to balance. The downside with Donkey Kong's level design, however, and I'm sure we've all heard this complaint before, is that everything is kind of segmented with an awful amount of backtracking, and in some levels it can become a smidgen tedious, especially given some of the later levels being obnoxiously big.
If backtracking is such a big problem, then why is Rocket Robot on Wheels and Banjo not still higher on this list than Donkey Kong 64? As in both of those segments you talk about how there is very little to no backtracking there. Why does Donkey Kong get a pass to have backtracking, despite having it worse than any of the others on the list too, as told by your number 10 segment?
However, the backtracking with Rocket not only is pretty minimal, but feels less like needless padding for the sake of challenge, and actually feels important to the rest of the game. Looking at you, Donkey Kong, you sadistic monkey. I love you.
This, along with so far everything else, has shown me that your list was very haphazardly put together with no real care or effort put into it, and we're less than halfway through the list. Typically, I'm not one for using hyperbole in videos, but I believe I'm developing tumors from this cancerous autism.
Dreams can be one hell of a concept to play with. They don't have to abide by the laws of reality, so generally speaking, if a game is built on dreams, they inherently have a lot of wiggle room to play around and experiment with. They could go the surreal route, which people tend to enjoy because it puts into question just what kind of imagination the developers had, or you can stay more grounded in your dreams and just use the concept to prevent yourself from staying in a singular or limited theme. 40 Winks keeps to the latter option, allowing them to play with their level design, but keeps it reasonable as not to throw off their players at every turn. One level can be based on a haunted mansion, the next you could be in Atlantis.
Isn't this almost exact copy and paste from your Rocket Robot on Wheels segment? And Rocket isn't even based in dreams, so what's its excuse for having such a diverse set of levels? This whole thing at the beginning felt like a really bad setup, only used to pad out the entry, and not to actually introduce it.
So back to the idea of licensed games being not that bad all the time, we come to one that I don't know if it was predicted to be playable, but is and is somehow really good. I don't know why, but SpongeBob games are oddly consistently good with only a few black sheep surrounding the series that I'm aware of. I mean, they certainly have their fair share of issues, but generally speaking, they're not only really fun games, but have some replayability to them. Now, while I like the game based on the movie, despite how patternistic it can be, and Revenge of the Flying Dutchman is Battle for Bikini Bottom is easily better of the collectathon SpongeBob titles. It plays as your typical collectathon, but works in its own way that allows you to collect your MacGuffin of the game, the golden spatulas, as you work towards an end goal in kind of a side-questy sort of way.
Doodle, I don't know how you didn't see That you described games like Sly Cooper and the Tedious Racoonus, a game that you said was excluded from this list. The first Sly game was entirely built on the concept of getting the keys to unlock a mechanism so that Sly can get to the boss of the area, and collect the pages for the Tedious Racoonus. At the end of the day, the keys were merely a side quest to the main goal of page collecting. Generally, the last two entries are fine. My only complaint is the tie for first place, but that's not particularly a big deal, as you can see. For a person who's known for getting onto Countdown's cases for not sticking to a criteria and breaking their own rules, Doodle's not particularly good at keeping that herself. You can see it in some of her other lists, but this one was the most egregious example. Honestly, I don't ever see Doodle improving, but maybe we can convince her to disown a Countdown. After all, she typically does that with her commentaries. Anyway, this has been Pink Robot, and I'll see you next time.